Good evening. I'm Amy Sangiolo, Vice Chair of the Newton Democratic City Committee and Chair of the new Climate Crisis Subcommittee. Before we get started, I would like to begin with a moment of silence as we reflect and remember the victims of today's horrible elementary school shooting in Texas. I'd like to welcome everyone to another one of our panels about the climate crisis. Today, we learned that man-made climate change increased the chances of a heat wave like that occurring in Pakistan and India by a factor of 30. 90 people have already died in the extreme heat, and the chances of this type of extreme heat will only increase further along with global temperatures. 2 people died and 43 people were injured in extreme weather events in Europe, where this May is expected to be the hottest on record. In New Mexico, a historic drought coupled with climate change has contributed to development of a colossal wildfire that has become the largest in state history. Whether because of the increased incidence of extreme weather, rising or warming seas, the energy crisis caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or any of 1,000 other reasons, people everywhere are recognizing that society has to change its relationship to fossil fuels. But what are the best ways of doing this? What has already been done and what is now being considered at the municipal, state, or federal levels? These are some of the questions we have attempted to address in our panels on the climate crisis. We hope to provide you with information to understand solutions being considered or implemented so that you can choose to get involved as a voter, as an activist, or as a consumer. Tonight, we have 2 Newton officials, Ward 2 City Councilor Emily Norton and Sustainability Co-Director Ann Berwick, and the Chair of the Newton Citizens Commission on Energy, Helena Brown, who will educate us about climate action being taken by the city. Moderating our panel this evening is Cambridge City Councilor Quinton Zondervan. Quinton has served on the Cambridge City Council since 2018, where he has focused on environmental justice, social justice, and climate justice. Quinton served as a member of the Climate Protection Action Committee, an appointed advisory committee of stakeholders that advise the city on climate change action, including 3 years as chair. He co-authored the Net Zero zoning petition that led to the city's Net Zero Action Plan adopted in 2015. He served as president and board chair of Green Cambridge and co-founded the Climate Action Business Association in Boston and currently serves as its president and board chair. Thank you for coming tonight, Quinton, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Amy. It's quite an honor to be among such an illustrious panel. So I'll start by introducing Ann Berwick, who's the co-director of sustainability for the city of Newton. And before that, she was the undersecretary for energy and then chair of the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities under Governor Deval Patrick, and has also been the head of the Environmental Protection Division in the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office and an attorney in the Natural Resources Division of the Alaska Attorney General's Office. So Ann will talk about strategies to require electrification of new buildings and using less and greening the rest. That means limiting waste and using renewables to power the electric grid and substituting electricity for heating fuels and gasoline. So, Ann, you have 5 minutes to talk about those topics.
Okay, very good. You want me to go now, Quinton, instead of
yeah, let's
okay, great. So as Quinton mentioned, so first of all, to be civilized, hello, all of you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. So as Quinton mentioned, the title of Newton's Climate Action Plan is Use Less, Green the Rest. So probably I'm telling you much of what you already know in that score. Use less means, obviously, use less meaning don't drive, walk or bike, buy less, throw away less, use efficient light bulbs, turn off the lights when you're not using them, etc. But we need to use some energy in our homes, right? Need to keep the lights on when we do need them, run our refrigerator, etc. So the answer is use more electricity, not less. But that electricity has to be clean. And that means solar, mainly in this part of the country, solar and wind, mainly offshore wind. So use more electricity. It has to be green. Use it for heating buildings using air source heat pumps or geothermal. And use it for transportation, electric vehicles. I have an amazing electric assist bicycle, which I love, tricycle actually. Newton is deeply involved in projects to green the energy grid further. That's what our solar developments on more than 20 city facilities now is about. And that's, I think that is more than any municipality in the Commonwealth. Quentin, correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm not talking about on a per capita basis, just absolute numbers. It's also about what Newton, it's also what Newton Power Choice is about, right? Encouraging the growth of renewable power. So Helena will tell you that the biggest problem we face is with existing buildings, and I completely agree with her. Most of what I have been doing on behalf of the city, however, has to do, or much of what I have been doing has to do with new buildings. The reason for that being, it makes no sense whatsoever to be building no buildings that rely on fossil fuels that we're going to have to eliminate in the very near future. So I've mainly been working on 3 different projects on behalf of the city in that regard. One is, like, I think 5 or 6 other municipalities, Newton's home rule petition, asking the legislature to give us authority to require all new buildings to be all electric, all new buildings and all substantial renovations of buildings. And believe it or not, we have to ask the legislature for that authority. We don't have it. We're preempted from doing that. And so for that reason, a number of cities and towns, I think it's 6 right now, have gone to the legislature to ask for home rule authority to require electrification of new construction. I've also been working closely with someone many of you know well, Representative Kay Khan, who has filed a bill that would mandate all new construction and substantial renovations in the Commonwealth to be all electric. So no more of this opt-in or asking the legislature for permission, right? Just all new construction has to be all electric. And after all, think about, for example, lead paint. We don't let cities and towns opt in or make a decision to adopt lead paint regulations, right? Is climate change less important? So Rep. Khan's bill would actually require all new construction to be all electric. And then I'm also working on the pending Senate bill that would allow some number of towns, the numbers yet to be determined, somewhere between 10 and probably 70, to again opt in and require that all new construction be all electric without going through the rigmarole of going to the legislature to ask permission. So those are the 3 legislative mechanisms that I've been working on, and one other matter that's related, which is commenting on behalf of the city on the state's new stretch code proposal, which once again would, which at this point in its drafting, the state has not allowed cities and towns, or is not allowing cities and towns to require electrification of new construction. So a city has commented saying that's inappropriate. Cities and towns have to be allowed to require new construction to be all electric. So let me stop there and just say the thing to remember, I think, about what I'm saying is that we have to use more electricity, not less. We have to use it in place of heating oil and natural gas for heating. We have to use it in place of gasoline and diesel fuel for transportation. The electricity has to be generated with solar, wind, hydro, not with fossil fuels. So I think my 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes. Thank you
so
Quinn,
much. Thanks so much.
interrupting me, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, you're perfect. So next we'll hear from Emily Norton, who's a Newton City Councilor and Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. And before that, she was the Massachusetts Chapter Director for the Sierra Club. And she's also worked for Conservation Law Foundation, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, Environmental Defense Fund, USEP Energy Star. Emily's done a lot. So Emily has a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Vermont and a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. And she'll talk about the tree ordinance, strengthening the tree ordinance, getting building electrification ordinance through labeling gas pumps, BERDO, the building energy reduction ordinance, and continue to pressure Mass DOT to make Newton commuter rail stops ADA accessible. So take it away, Emily.
Well, Quentin, you just gave it all away. I guess I'm done. Well, thank you so much. I first want to start out, just thank you so much to the Newton Democratic City Committee for putting this event together and for inviting me and being able to be on this panel with these amazing leaders that I learned from so much from. Quentin is just like trying to keep up with what Quentin is doing in Cambridge is exhausting. For the record, I'd like to point out that Cambridge City Councilors are full-time with full-time staff. Just pointing that out. That may be part of what. All right. We can quibble over how much it's full time, but to compared to us. And I wanted to thank Amy for her words reminding us of the urgency of what we're facing. We're at carbon dioxide levels now that we've never been at while there have been humans walking on the planet. Arguably, we're all in a huge chemistry experiment. And we're already seeing the impacts. Obviously, this past weekend was just yet another example to have mid-90s in May. I grew up in Newton. I'm actually in the house I grew up in. Homes didn't even have air conditioning back in the day. Now you can't imagine building a new home without air conditioning because of the way the climate is. So the need couldn't be more urgent, and it can be very frustrating. I know that I recognize many of the names that are watching tonight, and I know that it can be very scary, and climate anxiety is a real thing. I personally find it gratifying and helpful to be acting even at the local level. And I say even at the local level, yet I actually would argue that what Newton does matters disproportionately more than maybe what some other communities do. When you think about Newton, we are a community, maybe not as much as Cambridge, but up there, that other communities in Massachusetts emulate. And Massachusetts is a state we know that other states emulate. When you think about first public library, gay marriage, we were the first state to ban those little things after Las Vegas, gun stocks, I can't remember what they're called. But anyway, there's a whole mess of things that Massachusetts has been first on. So the things that we do, I think, do matter, maybe more than what other communities do. So I feel very privileged to be in a position to do something about that. So I wanted to share my screen. I have one very, very simple slide because that is the level of technology that I can bring to the table. There we go. When I started out doing this work, it was a lot of communities were setting 2050 goals.
Emily, we don't see
Emily,
your slide.
We're still
You
seeing
don't?
the old one.
No, you need to stop sharing your screen and then reshare.
Sorry. All right, hold on. Sorry about that. Let me just maybe close that other one. And
I saw it.
all right, how about now? Yeah, do you see a little? Okay. What I wanted to, so when we were setting goals in the very beginning, it's very easy to set a goal, where we should be by 2050. Okay, very easy to do. But unless you back that up with, well, if you're going to be all electric by 2050 or all EV by 2050 or all heat pump and ground source heat pump by 2050, well, when you have 30-year boilers, when you have vehicles that last a dozen years, et cetera, then you need to start planning right away. So for me, it was helpful to think, okay, you've got sort of these three categories in the city: municipal, residential and small business, and large institution and businesses, sort of your Boston colleges, your, the mall, et cetera, or the stores at the mall. And then within each of those categories, you've got your electricity, your transportation, and your heating and cooling. If you've gone green in all of those categories, then you've covered most of what we need to cover. And they each take different approaches. So with residential small business, Newton Power Choice, which I was proud to have play a role in and bringing that to Newton, that's actually getting us a long way toward being all electric for our residential and small business. Anne talked about the city level, our solar projects, clean energy contracting, and then within our transportation now, and there's not enough time to go through all of these, but that's how it was helpful to me to think about this in the early days. In terms of some things that we have already done, we have divested from fossil fuels, not from our pensions, because that we would need state permission to do. We've done Newton Power Choice. We've done a lot of municipal solar. Our new big projects are largely all electric. NUMO is a great program. That's the program that's sort of like our own local Uber, but it's helping people complete that last mile so they can get to public transportation if they don't live close enough to walk. And we've done a lot of plastic reduction: bags, nips, polystyrene. There's much more we can do, but plastic is, is an oil-based product, is a fossil fuel-based product. So reducing plastics also addresses oil consumption. Areas that we can be, and we are working toward, Anne mentioned the building electrification home rule petition. BERDO, which is, I actually had to, I think it's building energy reduction disclosure ordinance. That is something that maybe we can get into in the discussion. But that is how we can get to our larger institutions and companies. That's what Boston has done, and we can look at them for an example. Gas pump labeling is something that would help, I think, on the marketing side. If we had something, again, that Cambridge has done, which remind people every time you go to fill up, if you see a label, just like you see on cigarette labels, warning this product causes cancer, if you saw a warning, this use of this product causes climate change, and sent you to a website for some alternatives, whether it's electric vehicles, biking, walking, etc., I think that could help on the marketing side of reminding people there are things that we can do. You probably just saw in the mayor's newsletter a few days ago that that Governor Baker put $85 million into the supplemental budget for upgrading our 3 commuter rail stops. That is fabulous news. So, increasing our public transit overall, throwing on Meatless Monday and looking at diet. That's Meatless Monday is something that other school districts have done. I tried to get that done here in Newton, was not successful, but maybe someone else can take that up. And then I just want to end to remind us, because we are already seeing the effects of climate change. We don't have the luxury of just focusing on the mitigation side. We need to also be focusing on the adaptation side. Here in this part of the world, so far, we're not seeing huge fires, but we are seeing increased precipitation, and that is going to increase quite a bit in coming years and decades. And we are seeing increased heat. So these are not all of the solutions, but for heat, it's really, really important that we be increasing our tree canopy, particularly in areas of the city that have a lot of asphalt. For flooding, we want to be looking at green stormwater infrastructure, how we can be bringing nature back and using nature-based solutions to hold in water to prevent flooding. Our plantings, to be pro-pollinator. I know that's something that some other city councilors are working on. And this last piece is just that when we do look at electrification, we do want to always be focusing on energy efficiency first. So that's just a lot of information all at once. But those are some things that I am excited to be working on, hopefully with all of you. Thank you
so much. Thanks so much, Emily. Okay, and then finally we'll hear from Helena Brown, who is the chair of the Newton Citizens Commission on Energy. And Helena is also Professor Emerita of Environmental Science and Policy at Clark University, a co-founder and board member of Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiatives, SCORI, the chair of the Newton Citizens Commission on Energy, and a fellow of TELUS Institute, and she has a doctorate in chemistry from New York University. And Helena will talk about the Citizens Commission, the greenhouse gas inventory, and BERDO.
Thank you. Thank you, Quentin, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for Amy, especially for inviting me to this forum. So, Energy Commission, its full name is Newton Citizens Commission on Energy, was established in 1979 by ordinance passed by City Council. And its mission, as defined at that time, is very much relevant to our current work. It says something like develop plans to encourage conservation of energy and use of alternative energy forms. Today we say renewables. Make recommendations to the mayor, to the city council, file legislation, and a few other things. So we are a body of 9 appointed members. We are appointed by the mayor, city council, school committee, League of Women Voters, and the Chamber of Commerce. And we are for 3-year terms, renewable terms. We are mostly, our members are mostly very technical people, but not entirely, because technical approach can only go so far in solving the complex climate problem. So we need to have a broader vision. We like to get things done. So we analyze, we do analysis, collect data, come up with ideas for policy. And when we have those ideas, we try to work with the grassroots community on one hand, and with the city on the other hand, essentially to develop these ideas and put them in practice. So we are both sort of like a think tank and also an advocate in both, have both roles. So one of the things we have done recently is last summer, we conducted an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions in Newton. And we tracked these emissions from various sources over the preceding 6 years. So we looked at energy use and on greenhouse gas emission. It's not the same, right? You could be using a lot of electricity, but if it's renewable electricity, then there is no accompanying greenhouse gas emissions. So we look at both. And we found 2 things that were most important. One of them is something we already knew, more or less, that buildings are the biggest source of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Very specifically, 65% of our emissions are from building, commercial and residential. Residential is a bigger chunk, 38. Commercial is 27, but they both large, significant. The second thing was maybe more sobering, which we didn't know what the answer would be until we finished the work, is that we haven't made any progress in the last 6 years. Especially the use of electricity is flat. It hasn't really moved up and down. But the heating fuel in Newton has increased in use by 5% in the residential sector and 8% in the commercial sector. Overall, when we translate all this energy into greenhouse gas emissions, our gas emissions went up by 2%. And it would have been 6% if we didn't have Newton Power Choice. So Newton Power Choice, with its 80% renewable content, made a difference. But you can see that this is a terrific program. Everybody knows it. But it's only, it only helped us by 4% of the total use of energy. Now, what we find in Newton is essentially tracks what's happening in the country as a whole. The situation, let me step back for a moment and then come back to Berdo that I want to talk about. The big problem is that energy use is related to economic growth, right? For every % increase in GDP, gross domestic product, energy use increases by somewhere around about 0.6%. It's not one-to-one relationships, but still, right? There are different estimates. Some say 0.5, some say 0.7. Let's use 0.6, all right? So we always talk about economic growth as a good thing, but the downside of it is that as it grows, the energy demand grows. So think about it. If our economy grew now for 3% a year for the next 30 years, it would increase to 2.5 times what we are today. 3% a year for 30 years. In other words, whatever we use now, we would be using 150% more in addition to what we're using now. And what would happen with the energy use? It would increase by 70% of what we have now. So the challenge, as you can see, is enormous. It's not only reducing drastically what we now use, but we are basically playing this catch-up game as our demand grows. So it really is a tremendous challenge for all of us. The solution, we have to find a way to have a thriving economy and thriving city of Newton, while at the same time using less energy. That is the only, and a significantly less energy. So some people say all you have to do is electrify. Electrification is fantastic, totally necessary, but absolutely not sufficient. We must also reduce the demand. So that brings me to buildings in Newton, which are responsible for 65% of our emissions. So what we are doing right now is basically part one of the story. We are addressing commercial buildings. We haven't really addressed the residential sector, but that will come. It will have to come one of these days. So both Anne and Emily already mentioned Berdo. I'll say only a few words about it because we can have a bigger discussion. But essentially, Berdo is an ordinance that was adopted recently by Boston, and we are modeling our ordinance, which is under development, on Boston ordinance. It has two major components. Component one, building owners of buildings above certain size, I won't go into the details, right, have to report every year to the city their energy use and their greenhouse gas emission. And these reports would be publicly posted. But that's only part of it. The second part is that they have to meet predetermined by the city emission standards. And these emission standards are tailored for something like 13 different kinds of buildings, because the uses, whether it's school or a hospital, makes a big difference, right? And these targets that have to be met are going to go down at intervals, regular intervals, about 5 years, every 5 years, until hopefully in 2050, all these buildings will be net zero in terms of greenhouse gas.
Thanks so much, Alina, for
right. So this
that
is where
excellent
we are.
explanation. So let's talk about Berdo. And a few years ago, I tried to ban fossil fuel combustion and new construction in Cambridge, modeled on Brookline's effort, and the whole thing came to a screeching halt when the Attorney General ruled that we couldn't do that because of state preemption. Now in California, and to some extent the state of New York now, they have a statewide framework for how they're going to get to net zero buildings. But in Massachusetts, we don't, which is why we're all doing it ourselves in our municipalities, modeled on the Bordeaux legislation in Boston. So one part of the question, which we'll get to in a minute, is how do we fix the state? Because we need a state regime that actually allows us to do what we're doing. But since we don't have that, I would like to hear from Anne and Emily what you see as some of the major obstacles to moving this Bordeaux legislation forward in Newton.
Anne, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are a number of questions embedded, right? I mean, I don't think we know yet that there are going to be major obstacles. I mean, I certainly hope there won't be. But Boston now had the reporting part of the Bordeaux ordinance for a number of years, right? I don't know, 6, 7. And yeah, how many, Helena? Whatever.
I think it's 8 to 10,
8,
something.
maybe. Anyway, it's quite a while. And just a year ago about enacted the actual reduction part of that ordinance. So there hasn't been, to Boston's credit, they did a big job with outreach. We certainly plan on doing the same here in Newton. I think I'm hoping the city council will be on board. I think probably it will be. The mayor is on board. And I'm hoping the business community, which has had mixed feelings about the electrification effort in the home rule petition, you know, is increasingly recognizing the, you know, the catastrophe we potentially face and will be on board also. So I don't want to really, Quentin, say, well, there are going to be big challenges and barriers to the adoption of Bordeaux and Newton. I hope there will not be. In terms of the question you asked about a state regime that will mean that we don't have to keep going to the legislature to ask permission to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, I think for electrification, KCON's bill is the answer to that, right? A mandate for electrification of all new construction. I completely agree with Helena that existing buildings are the bigger problem, that electrification isn't the entire answer, but we all agree it's a big piece of the answer. It's a substantial piece of the answer. So we need, you know, we're not California, we're not New York, we're home rule state. That's not going to change. And so we need legislative authority to do what we need to do, which is at a minimum require electrification, allow cities and towns to require the electrification of new construction. I'll stop there, even though I have a lot of other things I'd like to say.
I know that each of us could fill up the entire time, I'm sure.
For sure.
I do think there will be obstacles to Bordeaux. It's complicated. Many of us can't even remember what Bordeaux stands for. So anything that's complicated is right there. If you can't easily explain it to the public, that's more of a challenge. So it's going to be really on those of us who are advocating for it to really break it down, make it understandable, be very clear and transparent about the expected costs, do a lot of hand holding and outreach and support for the businesses so they understand. We had originally wanted the building electrification ordinance to include the business sector, and that was that did not happen, which was unfortunate. So I hope that we don't move forward in the same way with Bordeaux because time is running out. And we know that we are fortunate that we have a community in Newton that cares a lot about climate, is worried about it and so forth, as we do in the state overall. Actually, when you look at polls, I think the issue is that when you come down to the specifics, what, I can't have a gas stove anymore. So we really have to be working with people and be compassionate but also I think firm about where we're trying to get to. And if this is what we want to get to, the IPCC says we got to reduce emissions 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. You do the math on that, that's some pretty significant actions, and a leader community like Newton should be doing more. In terms of the state, I am frustrated at the rate of action of our state legislators, and I've spent a lot of time lobbying them. I don't know how many people know the story of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. Probably a lot of people here do. Do you know how many times it caught on fire though? It caught on fire chronically for over 100 years before it made national news in 1969 or whatever it was. And then it was like, oh my goodness, a river of water catching on fire. That's terrible. And, Silent Spring had been published, and, the environmental movement was growing. But I just think of that story, and I like to share that story because it's a reminder that for whatever reason, humans beings, we need the 2x4 between the eyes over and over until we will act. So it is my I am quite sure that at some point the state legislature is going to get their act together and really be bold, even bolder than the bills that they've already each passed. We don't know what the final one will look like. And it may be that human nature being we'll have to see more disasters. I hope that's not the case. That may be the case, but at least if that is the case, that we are ready with the policies. And so this development of policies and having local communities go above and beyond so that the state can look at that and be like, oh, well, maybe this is what we should do. This is, what Cambridge has done, what Newton has done. This is the direction we should be going, and we should be doing it very quickly.
Thanks. Yeah, in Cambridge, we're actively updating our BUIDO ordinance, Building Energy Use Disclosure Ordinance, to add emissions reductions. The disclosure has been in effect since 2014. And we're definitely facing some opposition from the business community. And part of the challenge is that, again, because we don't have a state regime, Boston adopted essentially a price on carbon of $234 a ton as an alternative if the building doesn't reduce their emissions. And the challenge is that the businesses are saying, hey, we don't want to pay that. So, there's a conversation to be had there about how to make sure that we get broad agreement that we have to move forward in this way. And that is primarily addressing the existing buildings. The new buildings, we're saying, we totally agree with you, and no more fossil fuels. Those buildings are net zero from day one. So we agree that the con bill is the way to go, but unfortunately these bills can linger in the House for a long time. So I'm curious if the panelists have opinions on the home rule approach, and maybe explaining that a little bit to the audience, what exactly is happening with these home rules and how effective we think that strategy is.
Yeah, I mean, I can do that. If that's okay with others. I mean, 2 months ago, I would have said the home rule strategy, the home rule petitions, had a minimal, very minimal chance of passing. But the Senate bill that's now in conference committee actually said that 10 communities should be allowed, essentially as pilots, to require electrification of new construction, and that those 10 will be whatever 10 communities actually have home rule petitions pending as of the date of whatever bill goes into effect that emerges from the conference committee. So Newton is under the wire there, as are, I think it's 6 other communities. So I think that home rule strategy will probably, even though it wasn't in the House bill, will probably be successful because it was absolutely the rock bottom proposal on electrification, right? Senator Friedman introduced an amendment that would have required substantially more towns to qualify. Senator Eldridge, same deal, more towns. And Senator Comerford from Western Mass actually introduced Rep. Khan's bill as an amendment to that legislation and then withdrew it. Anyway, I think there will be in the, I predict there will be in the emerging legislation, some number of towns will be allowed to require electrification of new construction, and Newton, having gotten under the wire, will be one of those. I think it's not a good strategy, even though I love Rep. Khan's, well, because it's not a good strategy because it's opt-in. The success of Newton Power Choice depends really largely on the fact that it is opt-out. If you do nothing, you're at 80% renewable, right? And we know from 3 different surveys that the vast majority of Newton residents are willing to pay a lot more, much more than they would have to pay under Newton Power Choice for 100% renewable power. So opt-out is the way to go, not opt-in. And Rep. Khan's bill isn't even opt-out, it's simply a mandate. But this opt-in business doesn't work very well, right? You just don't
Right.
get that many towns participating. So
Yeah,
let me stop.
it's not great state level policy. Helena?
I would like to add to something that was said earlier about, that we need a statewide policy. I think it's worth thinking about what things are best done at the state level and what things are best done on the municipality level, with some maybe enabling conditions from the state. So certainly building code absolutely is and must and should be done on a state level. So the current work in progress over making this building code, our future building code, much more ambitious than it was, and then it was proposed by DOER. That's definitely state. Electrification, definitely the state. But I am not sure about existing buildings. It's not clear to me because, and let's group them into commercial and residential. For commercial buildings, the issues that Cambridge is facing with commercial buildings are very different from those that Newton is facing, because the buildings, the labs, the major universities, right, very different, and much bigger contributor to greenhouse gas emissions from Cambridge than commercial sector in Newton, right? And now take some sort of a town in Western Massachusetts, Amherst, for example. Would the same state legislation for improving existing buildings work equally well in those very diverse settings? I am not sure. I think we should think about it more. All right. Now, when it comes to residential sector, I definitely think that this is in the hands of municipalities, because in order to get, and here we are much more constrained about mandates, right? It's politically just impossible. So we need to be much more nuanced about the policy package, combination of mandates, incentives, outreach, and so on and so forth. And for that, I think you need a very short distance between the government, the green community, and the residents. And I think that municipalities are much better at that than the state.
I think that's a really great point. I think what I was suggesting was that we would have a regime within which the municipalities could take action. Right now, we don't even have that. But let's hear from Emily.
Well, we have a model to look at. When a homeowner wants to sell their home, they have to disclose, whether you're in a flood zone, lead, you have to bring your septic, if you live on the Cape, up to snuff. One could imagine, because we do have to get to the existing sector, we can't just expect new construction and major renovation to get us there. One could imagine that when you go to sell your home, we could require that it has to be fossil fuel free. I mean, that would be extreme, not extreme compared to what we know is coming if we don't do these things. So, you know, and then I see in the chat, there's some points about how much the city is publicizing heat pump incentives. I was shocked when I went to get a heat pump. There were actually 2 incentives at the time that I only knew about because I work in this field. Mass Clean Energy Center had one, and Mass Save both had heat pump incentives, but it was almost impossible to find. So for those who live in Newton, you know what the city does when we want to get an override passed. You can't drive by an intersection without seeing a sandwich board urging you to, you know, vote for the override, people holding signs, whatever. One could imagine if we really put our marketing muscle into encouraging EVs, encouraging heat pumps, letting people know about these things, we could be doing a lot more even before we get to the mandate point.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about that a little bit, because I know that there's a lot of homeowners who have questions and concerns about, you know, well, how do I pay for all this? You know, who's going to pay for the solar panels and the air source heat pumps and the induction stoves and the insulation and all of that? And then we haven't even talked about tenants who can't even, you know, do all those things even if they wanted to. So how do we get down to the individual resident of Newton, in this case, to support them in these efforts? Anne?
Yeah, I mean, one of the answers to that, I know it's not entirely satisfactory, is new construction, right? It's not the case that new construction that is all electric is more expensive. So, you know, and if it's more expensive, it's by a trivial amount, right? We've used it for affordable housing all over the state. It's a different story if you're talking about retrofits, which is one of the problems with dealing with existing buildings. So, but for new construction, it is an absolute no-brainer. I just want to address one question I know that Helena brought up, and I know you're aware of this, Helena, but you said, you know, for residential, tricky to deal with on a statewide basis. But, you know, KCON's bill does include residential, and it's because it's for new construction that I think it's
New
not,
construction,
yeah,
I agree.
I think it's not tricky because it's new construction. I agree with you that residential for existing buildings is a much tougher nut to crack. But I just want to point out that for new construction, it seems to me statewide mandate is totally appropriate. Quinn, can I say one more thing that isn't responsive to anything you've said? And that is, Emily on her list had meatless Mondays, and nobody's talked about meat here. Agriculture is thought to be responsible, give or take, for 15% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that's partly, you know, it looks different in Iowa than it looks in Massachusetts. But you don't have to become a vegetarian or a vegan to substantially reduce the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to food consumption. You know, meatless Mondays, 1 out of 7, that's a significant proportion. 2 days out of 7, even more significant. And that's about eating meat and cow milk products.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it is an important topic. It's challenging for us in the urban core to, you know, really have much of an impact, to be frank. And there's also some controversy around, you know, because not all meat is the same. If we're talking about, you know, CAFOs and so forth,
No, it's
absolute
not.
disaster.
That's right.
But if we're talking about, you know, pasture, grass-fed beef, there's actually a potential role for that in the ecosystem. So, you know, it's a nuanced conversation, but I think here we should focus on buildings, because, you know, as Helena said, in Newton, that's 65% of your emissions. In Cambridge, it's 80%. Helena, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add something about reaching out to homeowners. The Newton Energy Commission has just sponsored a survey and a series of focus groups that my colleagues John Sloat and Philip Vergraach have just completed. They haven't announced the results yet. I don't know fully, but what they found among key things is that what they found is that people don't know what the city is doing for climate, and we're doing a lot, and they also don't know about, as you said, Emily, about the existing subsidies, enormous in some cases. So I think it behooves us to, now that we don't have press in Newton, right? How do we reach people, right? And I think this is a really, really serious problem, because when people don't know what's going on, they assume one of two things. They either assume that nothing is happening and the government is screwing up, or that the worst thing happens and the government is screwing up even more, right? So this is something that we really need to figure out. We need the same sandwich boards and the same, energy bulletin every week to everybody's mailbox. Here's what we've done this week. This is what's available to you, and so on. I really think, because if we want support for these future policies that are still ahead of us, how to reduce emissions from buildings, right? We need support of the people, or at least understanding. It's not going to happen until we get smarter somehow.
I couldn't agree more. And, it goes, I think, beyond that, because if we make it just about personal responsibility, it essentially is, as Anne would say, opt in. But if we make it about, here's how it's going to work, here's where you get the subsidies, here's where you buy your solar panels and your source heat pumps, then it just becomes part of doing business. And we absolutely have to decouple, as was said earlier, our economic activity from fossil fuel combustion, which is never easy. So any final comments from our panelists before we close out? We're rapidly approaching the hour here. Emily, you haven't spoken in a while. Any final thoughts?
Well, I wondered if there's anything in the Q&A that we would want to address. I see a lot of comments in the chat. Questions about development, questions about teardowns, questions about, well, the first one was whether we look at the source of our electricity, including whether we look at the source of the solar projects. Let's see, Melissa asked, is Newton Power Choice looking at the sources of electricity and whether they come from problematic sources like AD Makepeace's dirty solar that comes from clear cutting hundreds of acres of forest and then strip mining silica sand in Southeast Mass pine barrens? That is a great question. I do know that we do require Class 1 RECs, which means clean energy from our region, which is really important, because it's actually, if you buy clean energy certificates from Texas or the Midwest, they really don't make that much of a difference. It's actually cheaper to build renewable projects in those parts of the country than fossil fuel projects at this point, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. In this part of the world, however, fossil fuels are still cheaper. So making sure that we buy our clean energy locally helps make sure that projects do get built. I don't know to what extent we look into the details of the projects themselves. And do you have any idea if we do that?
No, we specified, I believe, in Newton Power Choice that we want to focus on solar and wind.
Okay.
But we don't look at, this solar developer versus that solar developer.
Okay.
All right. Helena, any
I would
final
like to
comments?
just say something about responsibility, right? It's been shown time and time again in studies that household income is the best predictor of the carbon footprint of that household. Right? Tell me your income, I'll tell you what your household footprint is. Right? So we are living in a city in Newton, which is a wealthy city. Okay, it's not evenly distributed as well, but overall, it's a wealthy city, which means two things. One is that our carbon footprint is high. And number two, that we have that much more responsibility for doing something. One is because we consume so much energy, and one because overall we can afford to do something about it. So this is how I see our responsibility in Newton.
Thank you. And
Yeah, I want to add to that, and to some extent, Helena, I'm aware I'm channeling you here, is that personal responsibility isn't going to get us where we need to go entirely, right? We need mandates. We have to tell, as Quinn says also, we have to tell people, like, this is the new regime. This is how the world here is going to operate, and it can't be just Newton, it has to be statewide. When it's just Newton, you hear the Chamber of Commerce complaining, well, we're going to be at a competitive disadvantage from Needham. And frankly, I have some sympathy with these businesses. They've been hit over the head by COVID. Now it's really hard to hire people. Their supply chain problems, you know, they're not just, you know, crying wolf. They have real problems. So we have to have statewide mandates, which is not to say that we don't have a level of personal responsibility. That's not going to get us where we need to be.
thanks so much, Anne, and thanks all of you, Emily and Helena as well. Newton's lucky to have such knowledgeable and thoughtful leaders working on this difficult problem. I'll hand it back to Amy to close us out.
Sorry, I was muted. Well, thank you, Quentin, Anne, Emily, and Helena. I also want to give a special shout out to Gary Rosinski for putting the panels together, Lucia Dolan for creating our ads, and the entire subcommittee for their dedication and commitment to addressing our climate crisis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please keep an eye out because we're going to have more in this series in the future. And thank you everyone for coming this evening. We look forward to seeing you again at other discussion panels. I know that there are some other questions that are still out there. Please send them to amysangiolo@gmail.com. We will get those answers addressed. And hopefully, if you guys have any other ideas for future forums, please send them to me as well. And we will make sure that we'll try to get those as we continue on and do our best to fight the climate crisis here in Newton. So thank you all for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Much.